There's an old story about two wolves fighting inside you, one representing greed, one representing patience. And everyone asks which one wins, the answer, whichever one you feed. But here's what that story gets wrong. In trading, both wolves are you. Greed isn't some external demon you need to defeat. It's the part of you that wants growth, progress, achievement. And patience isn't virtue, it's the part of you that knows growth requires time. The war isn't good versus evil. It's now versus later, certainty versus probability. The part of you that wants everything today fighting the part that knows everything takes repetition. And until you understand that both voices are trying to protect you, you'll keep sabotaging yourself trying to kill the wrong one. You think greed is about wanting too much money. It's not. Greed in trading is wanting the result without honoring the process. It's entering before your signal because waiting feels like wasting time. It's sizing up because your normal position feels too small for your ambitions. It's taking a fourth trade after hitting your daily limit because you're in the zone. Greed isn't about money, it's about impatience dressed up as opportunity. And you think patience is about waiting. It's not. Patience in trading is trusting that your edge will work over time, even when it's not working right now. It's taking the same position size on trade 100 as you took on trade 1. It's executing your stop loss even when every cell in your body believes the market will reverse. Patience isn't about waiting, it's about trusting process over outcome. The core pain we're addressing is this. You're not losing because you're greedy or impatient in some moral sense. You're losing because greed and patience are having a war inside you, and you don't know how to referee it. One day patience wins and you follow your rules. The next day greed wins and you override them. Your results aren't random, they're the cumulative output of whichever voice won the war that day. And you hate yourself for the inconsistency, not realizing that the inconsistency is the problem, not the symptom. What makes this different is most trading psychology content tells you to control your emotions or follow your plan. That's not helpful because it assumes the problem is simple disobedience. But the real problem is that greed and patience are both rational voices advocating for different timelines. Greed says optimize for today. Patience says optimize for 1,000 days from now. And they're both right within their timeframes. We're going to show you how to make them allies instead of enemies. The myth we're busting is that greed is bad and patience is good. That's childish morality. In trading, greed is the engine and patience is the brakes. You need both. Without greed, you won't take enough risk to grow. Without patience, you'll take too much risk and die. The goal isn't to kill one, it's to let them take turns driving. And knowing when to hand over the wheel is the entire game. The reframe is this: you're not at war with yourself. You're a committee of selves, each trying to optimize for different outcomes, and none of them have learned to communicate yet. This video will teach them to talk to each other instead of screaming over each other. I worked with a trader, let's call him James, who had a strange pattern. He'd take profit at exactly 1-to-1 risk-reward every single time. His setups had targets at 3-to-1. He'd tested them. They hit 3-to-1 60% of the time. But James would exit at 1-to-1, watch it run to 3 without him and feel sick. Then he'd do it again the next trade. When I asked why, he said, because I can't stand the idea of giving back profit. If I'm up, I need to lock it in or I feel like I'm gambling. Do you hear it? That's not strategy talking. That's fear. Fear masquerading as prudence. He was so afraid of greed, so afraid of holding too long and giving back gains, that he'd overcorrected into cutting everything early. But here's what's interesting. James didn't see this as fear. He saw it as discipline. He'd tell himself, I'm being smart, taking profit when I have it. And by framing it that way, he never examined whether the behavior was actually serving him. He was losing long-term by trying to protect short-term. His patience voice said, let the trade develop. The target is 3-to-1 for a reason. But his greed voice, disguised as risk management, said take it now before the market takes it back. And greed won every time because it presented itself as the responsible choice. We spent weeks working on this, and the breakthrough came when he reframed what greed actually was. He realized that taking profit early wasn't conservative, it was greedy. He was grabbing immediate gratification instead of trusting his process. Real patience wasn't holding forever, it was holding to target. And real greed wasn't letting winners run, it was refusing to let them develop. Once he saw that, once he understood that his discipline was actually impatience, everything shifted. He started holding to target. Not perfectly, but progressively. And his account started growing because he was finally letting his edge work. And I want you to really sit with this because it's counterintuitive. We typically think of greed as wanting more and patience as being content with less. But in James's case, the roles were reversed. His greed was manifesting as wanting the profit now, immediately, before the market could take it. And his patience would have been trusting that if he held to his target, the math would work over time. But he couldn't access that patience because he'd mislabeled what greed actually looked like in his trading. This is what I mean when I say both voices are you. James wasn't fighting some external demon called greed. He was fighting two parts of himself that both wanted him to succeed but had different strategies for how to get there. One part said lock in gains fast to protect yourself. The other part said let gains develop to optimize for long-term edge. And without a framework for deciding which voice to listen to, he just reacted to whichever one screamed louder in the moment. Imagine you're planting a fruit tree. Greed walks up and says, "I'm hungry now, let's eat the seed." You say, "No, that's stupid, we need to plant it." So you plant it. A week later, greed comes back. "Where's the fruit? This isn't working. Let's dig it up and plant something faster." You say, "No, it takes time." A month passes, tiny sprout. Greed says, "This is pathetic. We should have planted 10 trees, not one. Let's dig this up and plant more." You say, "No, let it grow." A year passes, small tree, no fruit yet. Greed says, "We've wasted a year. Cut this down and start over with a better strategy." And patience says, "The tree is growing. Trust the process." That's the war. Greed operates on a timeline of now. Patience operates on a timeline of eventually, and both voices are convinced they're optimizing for your success. Greed thinks patience is settling for mediocrity. Patience thinks greed is destroying future opportunity for present comfort. And here's the paradox. They're both right and both wrong. If you only listen to greed, you'll keep digging up the tree before it bears fruit. But if you only listen to patience, you might wait forever on a tree that's planted in bad soil. The skill isn't choosing one voice. It's knowing when each voice is correct. Greed is correct when it says take action, seize opportunity, don't let fear paralyze you. Patience is correct when it says trust process, let edge develop, don't abandon plans mid-execution. The question isn't which voice is right. It's which timeline are you optimizing for. If you're optimizing for feeling good today, greed wins. If you're optimizing for being profitable a year from now, patience wins. And most traders don't consciously choose. They just react to whichever voice is louder in the moment. And the voice that's louder is usually the one promising immediate relief from discomfort. That's why greed wins so often. It promises to end the discomfort of uncertainty right now. Patience asks you to sit in that discomfort longer. And humans are wired to avoid discomfort. So you keep choosing the voice that feels like relief, not realizing you're choosing short-term comfort over long-term success. Let me give you a concrete example. You're in a trade. It's up 1R, which is your normal exit, but it's showing strength. It might run to 2R or even 3R. Greed says, "This is the one, let it run, don't be a coward." Patience says, "Your rule is 1R, take it and move on, don't get clever." Which voice do you listen to? The answer depends entirely on your system. If your tested edge says hold to 3R and you exit at 1R out of fear, that's not patience, that's fear stealing from your edge. But if your tested edge says take profit at 1R and you hold hoping for more, that's not patience either, that's greed stealing from your edge. The point is, both voices can lead you astray if you don't have clarity on what your edge actually is. And most traders don't. They have a vague sense of when to enter and exit, but they haven't tested it rigorously enough to know whether holding is optimizing their edge or violating it. So they're left guessing. And when you're guessing, the loudest emotional voice wins. So if greed and patience are both trying to help you, just on different timelines, how do you actually resolve this war? How do you know which voice to listen to in any given moment? Let's break down the framework. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Every time you override your plan out of greed, sizing up, entering early, taking a fourth trade after your limit, you're not being ambitious. You're stealing from your future self. You're taking opportunity that was meant to compound over months and trying to compress it into today. And that compression destroys the opportunity entirely. Think about compounding. If you make 2% per week consistently for a year, you'll more than double your account. But if you make 20% one week trying to accelerate the process, then lose 15% the next week recovering from the emotional damage of that risk, you've destroyed the compounding. Your average might be the same, but the volatility killed the geometric return. Greed doesn't understand geometry. It only understands arithmetic. It thinks 2% per week is too slow, so let's make 10% this week. But it doesn't account for the fact that one bad week at high risk can wipe out months of good weeks at appropriate risk. When you size up out of greed, when you take that extra trade, when you hold past your target hoping for more, you're not optimizing for growth. You're optimizing for the feeling of growth happening fast, and that feeling is what destroys accounts, because the market doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about probabilities over time. And probabilities over time require you to survive variance, and greed makes you fragile to variance. So the lesson is simple. Every greedy decision is a theft from future you. You're taking the capital, the emotional stability, the trust in process that future you needs to succeed, and you're spending it today on the feeling of acceleration. And future you will pay the price. I've seen this pattern so many times. A trader builds their account slowly, methodically, following their rules. 2% here, 3% there. And then they have a moment where they think, I've been too conservative. I should be growing faster. I'm leaving money on the table. So they size up, they take trades outside their system, they hold past their exits, and maybe they have a good week. They make 15% and they feel vindicated. See, I was being too cautious. But what they don't realize is they've just planted a time bomb, because they've taught their brain that the rules were holding them back, that breaking the rules can work. And now, the next time they're in a trade and greed whispers, size up, their brain has evidence that it works. So they do it again, and maybe it works again, or maybe it doesn't. But either way, they've lost the thing that was actually making them successful, which was consistent adherence to a tested edge. That's what I mean by stealing from future you. You're not just risking capital. You're risking the psychological infrastructure that allows you to trade well long-term. You're undermining trust in process. And once that trust is gone, it's incredibly hard to rebuild. But here's the flip side. Patience isn't always the answer. I've seen traders use patience as an excuse to avoid taking trades. They wait and wait and wait, never pulling the trigger, telling themselves they're being disciplined. But what they're actually doing is avoiding the discomfort of risk. Real patience serves your edge. It's waiting for your signal, holding to your target, executing your plan over enough repetitions to let the probabilities work. But fake patience is just fear with a respectable name. It's waiting because you're afraid to be wrong, not because you're trusting process. Here's how to tell the difference. Real patience has criteria. I'm waiting for X, Y, and Z to align, then I'll act. Fake patience has vagueness. I'm waiting until it feels right. Real patience is active monitoring. Fake patience is passive avoidance. And the dangerous part is that fake patience feels virtuous. You're not overtrading. You're not being impulsive. You're being careful, measured, thoughtful. But you're also not trading. And if you're not trading, your edge can't express itself. You're waiting for a level of certainty that doesn't exist. And while you wait, opportunities pass, time compounds against you, and you convince yourself that you're being smart when you're actually being paralyzed. The lesson is patience is only valuable when it serves your edge. If you have a tested edge and you're not executing it because you're waiting for better opportunities, that's not patience. That's fear. And fear pretending to be patience is just as destructive as greed pretending to be ambition. I worked with a trader who hadn't taken a trade in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. When I asked why, he said he was being selective, waiting for the perfect setup. But when we reviewed the charts together, I showed him 12 setups that met his criteria perfectly. 12 opportunities he'd watched pass by. And when I asked why he didn't take them, he couldn't articulate a reason. He just said they didn't feel right. That's fear, not patience. He was so afraid of being wrong, so afraid of taking a loss, that he'd convinced himself that waiting indefinitely was prudent. But it wasn't. It was avoidance. And avoidance doesn't build wealth. It just delays the inevitable confrontation with uncertainty that trading requires. The reason greed and patience fight is because they're optimizing for different timelines, and you haven't chosen which timeline matters. Greed optimizes for this trade, this week, this feeling of progress right now. Patience optimizes for this year, this decade, this trajectory over time. And as long as you're unconsciously reacting to both voices without choosing which timeline you're committed to, you'll stay inconsistent. Some days you'll be patient, some days you'll be greedy, and your equity curve will reflect that chaos. But the moment you consciously choose your timeline, the war ends, not because one voice disappears, it doesn't, but because you've given yourself a tiebreaker. When greed says size up and patience says stick to your plan, you ask which serves my 1-year timeline. And suddenly the answer is clear. This doesn't mean you always choose patience. Sometimes greed is correct. If you have an edge and you're underutilizing your capital because you're being too conservative, greed is telling you to scale appropriately. That's not reckless, that's optimizing for long-term growth. But most of the time greed is asking you to deviate from process for the dopamine hit of acceleration. And patience is asking you to trust that boring, consistent execution compounds into extraordinary results. And if your timeline is long-term, patience wins. The lesson is stop fighting the war by trying to kill one voice. End the war by choosing which timeline you're committed to, then let that timeline determine which voice you listen to in any given moment. And I want to be really specific about what this looks like in practice. Before you enter a trade, before you adjust your position size, before you take that extra trade, you ask yourself one question. Does this decision serve my 1-year timeline or my right now timeline? Not which feels better, which serves the timeline you've committed to. If you've committed to building wealth over years and the decision serves today's dopamine hit, it's the wrong voice. That's your tiebreaker, and it's simple, but it's not easy. Because in the moment, your brain will offer you elaborate justifications for why this time is different, why this opportunity is special, why the rules don't apply right now. And you have to cut through all that noise and ask the timeline question. Here's something nobody tells you. The greed-patience war intensifies when you're winning. When you're losing, it's easy to be patient. You're in defense mode. You're playing it safe. But when you're winning, that's when greed gets seductive. You've had 3 winners in a row. Your account is up 15% this month, and greed whispers you're in the zone. The rules were for when you were struggling. Now you're flowing, size up. Take more trades, let the winners run past target. This is your moment. And patience says stick to the plan. This streak will end. Protect what you've built. But patience sounds boring compared to greed's promise of breakthrough. So you listen to greed, you size up, and the 4th trade wipes out half your gains because you took 3 times your normal risk. Or you're patient, you follow your rules, and you watch opportunities pass while you were being conservative, and you feel like an idiot for not capitalizing on your hot streak. Either way, winning makes the war harder to navigate. The lesson is this. Winning doesn't mean the rules no longer apply. It means the rules are being tested. And your willingness to follow your process during a winning streak is what separates traders who build wealth from traders who have lucky months. Because lucky months without process adherence become unlucky years. And nobody wants to be the person who made $1 million and lost it all because they believed they'd transcended the need for discipline. I've been that person. I've had months where everything worked, every trade hit, every decision seemed inspired, and I started to believe that I'd reached some new level where the rules were constraints for lesser traders. And I started taking bigger risks, more trades, holding longer than my system said, and for a few weeks it worked. I made more in those weeks than I'd made in the previous 3 months, and then reality caught up. One bad trade, then another, then a string of them, and suddenly I'd given back all those gains plus more. And I was sitting there, confused, angry, wondering how I went from feeling invincible to feeling incompetent in the span of 2 weeks. What happened? I let greed convince me that my winning streak was evidence of transcendence rather than variance. I forgot that my edge works over hundreds of trades, not 10 trades. I abandoned the process that got me the wins in the first place, chasing the feeling of being in the zone. And the market reminded me brutally that there is no zone. There's only process and deviation from process. And deviation, even when it works temporarily, always costs you eventually. So you understand the war, you understand the voices, you understand the timeline choice. But how do you actually implement this? How do you make greed and patience allies instead of enemies in real-time trading? Let's get practical. Before you deviate from your plan in any way, before you size up, take an extra trade, hold past target, enter early, pause and name which voice is speaking. Say out loud, this is greed asking me to accelerate, or this is patience asking me to wait. Just naming it creates awareness, and awareness creates choice. You can't negotiate with an unconscious voice, but you can negotiate with a named one. This sounds simple, but it's incredibly powerful, because right now, when greed speaks, you just act. There's no gap between impulse and action, but by naming the voice, you create that gap. You make the unconscious conscious. And in that moment of consciousness, you have choice. You can say, okay, I hear you greed, I understand you want to accelerate, but I'm choosing to listen to patience right now because it serves my long-term timeline. You're not fighting the voice, you're acknowledging it, and acknowledgement diffuses a lot of its power, because the voice isn't trying to sabotage you, it's trying to help, it just has a different strategy. And when you acknowledge that, when you say I see you, I understand what you want, but I'm choosing differently, the voice often quiets down. Not always, but often. Once you've named the voice, ask, does this decision serve my one-year timeline or my one-day timeline? Not which feels better, which serves the timeline you've committed to. If you've committed to building wealth over years and the decision serves today's dopamine hit, it's the wrong voice. This question is your tiebreaker. Use it every time the voices conflict. And you have to be honest with this question. Your brain will try to convince you that sizing up serves your long-term timeline because more profit is more profit. But that's not how it works. More profit with more risk is more volatility. And volatility kills compounding. So you have to ask, is this decision aligned with my tested edge, or is it a deviation hoping to accelerate results? If it's a deviation, it serves today, not tomorrow. Here's a counterintuitive move. Give greed a little bit of space intentionally. Set aside 5% of your capital as your greed account. When the urge to size up or take an extra trade hits, you can do it, but only with the greed budget. This serves two purposes. First, it gives the greedy voice an outlet so it doesn't sabotage your disciplined trading. Second, it contains the damage. If you blow up 5% chasing acceleration, you're still in the game. This isn't permission to be reckless, it's strategic harm reduction. Some people will hear this and think I'm condoning bad behavior. I'm not, I'm being realistic. You're going to feel the urge to deviate. And if you try to suppress it completely, it'll build up pressure and explode at the worst possible time. But if you give it a small, contained outlet, you satisfy the urge without destroying your account. Think of it like a pressure valve. If you seal a system completely and keep adding pressure, eventually it explodes. But if you have a controlled release valve, you maintain the system's integrity while releasing pressure safely. That's what the greed budget is. A controlled release valve for the part of you that wants to chase acceleration. After every trading session, write down which voice won today and what the consequence was. Greed won, I sized up, I made more but I felt anxious the whole trade. Or patience won, I stuck to my plan, I made less than I wanted but I feel in control. Over time, you'll see patterns. You'll see that greedy decisions feel good short-term and bad long-term. Patient decisions feel boring short-term and compounding long-term. Data breaks delusion. This is one of the most important practices because it creates empirical evidence for your brain. Right now, you probably have a vague sense that following your plan is better, but you don't have data. So when greed makes its case in the moment, it's persuasive. But when you have a journal showing that every time you listened to greed, you felt anxious, gave back gains, or blew up your rhythm, suddenly greed's case is less persuasive. Your brain responds to evidence. And if you give it evidence that patience compounds and greed volatilizes, it'll start to prefer patience. Not because you've become more disciplined, but because you've shown your brain the actual consequences of each voice. And your brain wants to optimize for good outcomes. It just needs accurate data about what creates good outcomes. Before you enter any trade, say this out loud. I am executing this trade to serve my long-term edge, not my short-term feelings. I will exit at my stop or my target. I will not override this plan no matter what greed or fear tells me. This isn't positive thinking, it's pre-commitment. You're locking in the decision before emotion arrives. And when emotion does arrive, you have something to anchor to besides the loudest voice. This ritual does something important. It makes your intention explicit before your brain is flooded with the neurochemistry of having money on the line. Because once you're in the trade, once you're watching price move in real time, your rational brain takes a back seat and your emotional brain drives. But if you've pre-committed, if you've stated your intention clearly before entering, you've created a psychological contract with yourself. And breaking that contract requires a conscious choice, not just an automatic reaction. So here's where we've been. You came here thinking greed and patience were moral categories, one bad, one good. But what we've uncovered is that they're both voices inside you trying to optimize for different timelines, and neither is wrong. Greed wants growth now, patience wants growth over time, and the war between them is what creates inconsistent trading. We talked about James, who took profit too early because he was so afraid of greed that he overcorrected into impatience disguised as discipline. We explored the two timelines parable, how greed wants to eat the seed while patience wants to grow the tree, and both are convinced they're right. And we broke down why greed is future self-theft, why patience without edge is just procrastination, and why the war intensifies when you're winning. The practices, naming the voice, asking the timeline question, creating a greed budget, journaling the war, building pre-trade rituals, they all point to one truth. You don't end the war by killing one voice. You end it by becoming a conscious referee who decides which voice serves your chosen timeline in any given moment. Here's your mantra. Say it when the voices get loud. Greed and patience are both me. Both are trying to help. I choose which one to listen to based on whether I'm optimizing for today or for 1,000 days from now. I am not at war with myself. I am a committee learning to communicate. Listen, you're going to hear greed tomorrow. It's going to tell you to size up, to take that extra trade, to hold past your target. And you're going to hear patience. It's going to tell you to stick to your plan, to let the edge work, to trust process over outcome. And in that moment, you have a choice. Not between good and evil, between now and later. And the traders who build wealth, they're not the ones who never hear the greedy voice. They're the ones who hear it, thank it for trying to help, and choose the voice that serves their long-term timeline anyway. If this landed for you, if you recognized the war, if you saw yourself in these patterns, if you're ready to stop fighting yourself and start refereeing yourself, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me which voice wins more often in your trading, greed, or patience. And subscribe because we're building the internal alignment that makes external results possible. You've got this. Not because the war will end, but because you're finally learning that the war is just two parts